I'm going to actually ask a follow-up question here. Then I'm going to bring in Sachin to kind of roll this all back up into the program. But we talked about industries. We talked about automotive in Germany. We talked about healthcare, banking, insurance, government. We know that the majority of business data, sits still at the edge. A lot of it, in mainframes that was mentioned. It's this relationship you have with your airline, the relationship you have with your bank, the government, all the history of transactions in those industries, sits on technology that might have been installed, 40 or 50 years ago. In terms of this AI era that we're stepping into, this next 20-year era of our industry, it all becomes about these industries and use cases wrapped around it. So I know we've mentioned it a few times, but I want to drill in there just as a follow-up to revenue. How has AWS helped you build these use cases? How have they helped you with the program kind of go deeper into these industries and kind of build out the success that we've kind of mentioned when we were talking about finding new customers and enriching current ones? Tom?
Yeah, thanks. So what we see now in Europe in general, I would say, is the industries who are pushing in managed services, or where we expect growth is manufacturing and automotive, as already mentioned a couple of times, financial services, and healthcare, life sciences. So this is what I think it was already mentioned by you. This is where we think we can grow further. How has AWS helped us with that? That's a tricky question, to be honest, because AWS is at the end of the day a horizontal company, right? So yes, we are all speaking about different verticals, but at the end of the day, we needed kind of to get our heads around those verticals, around the use cases we have seen and the use cases that were meant to be scaled. Yeah, so this was the most important part, and this is what we have done together with AWS. Yeah, constant exchange about what do we see in the market, what do we see, what kind of use cases are popping up in each industry, and which use cases are to be scaled. And I said one example was this connected car use case that has proven to be the use case that was scaled across all car manufacturers in the world, I would say.
That's fantastic. And, talking about Rackspace, I know you have 16 different industries listed on your website and obviously multiple different use cases. Love to hear kind of how working with AWS has helped you further dive into this view and obviously the use cases that you're selling in.
Let me just take the AI angle in here, because that was part of the original question, right? I'll probably say something that, it'll probably become well debated on LinkedIn and others. I've got a slightly counter view of how people view this. Everyone at this stage says, AI, you got to unlock the data, right? That's the only way you go do that. I think that is true if you're talking about generative AI. When you actually move into the agentic architectures, it is not it is not a do everything or don't, right? When you're actually implementing agents that are designed to do certain tasks, you can still go in and unlock that component of the data, so the data governance and everything else becomes a lot more simpler to do this. And why that's important and how AWS helps is, AWS, while they were 5 to 6, probably almost a year behind in entering into the AI market, the last 18 months, they're way ahead of the other hyperscalers, in my opinion, because they took the approach of having that loosely coupled, you pick your model, bring your model into this thing, and we'll drive it. And even with the latest announcements with Nova and everything else that they've done, the ability to distill large language models down with your data and run it in your instance is going to be huge to drive that. And for us, AWS has been pretty critical in building out my business, because it's like you're waiting for the tech innovation to show up, and it's consistently coming out of AWS. And so for us to kind of work with these guys hand in hand and say, let's go put this in place, let's go show customers how it runs. And now we're talking to AWS about, okay, how do we run it on your silicon? Because if I can distill that model down to a smaller size, I don't need these high-powered GPUs and other. I can run it on a Trainium and Inferentia instance in AWS's piece. So that tech innovation, that horizontal innovation that you talked about, is absolutely critical because, like, you know, I always love, like, one of the things AWS says that I love is when they did about security, Jonathan, as you talked about, when they came out, they said, we'll take care of the security of the cloud. You worry about the security on the cloud, right? It's the same thing. They're taking care of AI in the cloud, and I have to worry about how I enable these solutions and use cases on the front. And the tooling and what they're actually giving us is just spot on, which allows us to kind of keep advancing at the pace of which this domain is advancing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, in the world of agentic AI, a lot of that's going to be delivered in a headless model around SaaS. And the vast majority of SaaS companies built on AWS. So this idea of this integrated ecosystem and a very open company pulling it all together, you know, makes for a very, you know, strong next 3 to 5 years in the space. So talk about Kyndryl, you know, serving every one of the 27 industries and so many use cases as you dig in. How do you think about AWS in terms of helping you design these industry plays as well as these use cases that's earning you those new clients?
Sure, Jay. I think that's very interesting. You rightly said, see, Kyndryl, traditionally, we have been a horizontal services organization operating in all verticals, right? But we have not gone to the market internally, you know, we have not formed organizations, groups within our organization which are vertically aligned. And actually, I was in AWS for 4 years, and I was at that point of time when AWS started looking at, you know, verticalization and industry focus, starting with banking, financial services, and, you know, as we go along. So I think in that sense, I would say both AWS and Kyndryl come from this heritage where we have been taking these horizontal offerings to the market, and now we are realizing how we should customize our offerings based on the realities of that industry, right? And that's what we have been doing. So in the US, actually, we have started this exercise more deeply in terms of aligning ourselves. Like 45% of our revenues comes from financial services. So that's where our Kyndryl Consult team is actually working very closely now with the AWS team to identify which of those horizontal services that we have been taking to the market and how can we replicate that framework that we have taken to one successful customer and then taken it across that particular vertical industry. And for example, in manufacturing, automotive, energy utilities, there have been several success stories, for example, in SAP, where we have kind of modernized the environment, took from SAP, you know, legacy co-locations to on AWS for an energy utilities company. And now we're trying to see how we can take that solution for energy utilities, electrical, service providing companies, which are having all the learnings from that use case, which are very relevant for that, the other industries as well. For this purpose, we have also now been started working closely with the industry solutions team within AWS, specifically starting in the US, and now we'll be broadening it across the globe. I think at this point of time, since last year, I would say AWS has really realigned themselves industry-wise, focusing a lot on the key industries, and we are also aligning ourselves based on how AWS is going to the market. So within my alliance group, in AWS Alliance Group, we are talking the language of AWS when we are going to the market together by combining together all of the artifacts, collateral, intellectual property that we have within Kyndryl across various divisions, and then focusing ourselves and going to the market based on the industry realities. Yeah.
That's great. So Jonathan, in terms of eCloudvalley, looking at the industries, looking at the verticals and the use cases inside of those, how has AWS helped you in terms of digging that level deeper?
Sure. I think I'd say that we're not focused on any specific industry, but we are across all industries, right? I mean, like you guys mentioned, it's more horizontal than anything. I think the way AWS has helped us is, again, like I mentioned, the road mapping piece. Out of all the things that are being released, what are the things that are most applicable to our market, especially GCR, ASEAN? Maybe different from US or EMEA, which is probably more mature, I guess, right? But for our market, I mean, a good example would be, let's use FSI as an example, right? Bank to bank. With our partnership with AWS, we determined that we believe that getting that level 1 MSSP competency was the right move for us. Why? Because, I mean, if you're talking about FSI, that's probably the most regulated, most compliance-centric industry, right? But if you're talking about very similar banks, some of them would require a SOC, as an example, Security Operations Center, right? But another very similar bank, the same size, wouldn't need one, right? So from our perspective, it's never a one-size-fits-all, but going towards what is the right direction is really listening to our customers, and in Asia, ASEAN at least, right? A lot of FSI, a lot of telcos are really looking to do SOC. So we wanted to put more investment there as well, right? But again, it's across multiple industries, right? I wouldn't say that all industries would need a SOC, right? If you're talking about a smaller company, a startup, they would never need a SOC, right? But some companies who have evolved from small size to mid-size and then large enterprises, those are the ones that have more complex requirements, right? And that's where we get guidance from AWS to work with us in terms of what's the best possible solution out there. And that's what we've been using so far.
That's great. You make up a really good point. With 51 countries serving in APAC, for example, the compliance, the regulatory, the governance, touching all industries, but having that specific geographic experience makes a big difference.